Winter on the early American frontier was not romantic. It was not quiet or poetic. It was a test that killed people who guessed wrong. In the northern Rockies, winter didn't slowly arrive. It slammed down. 1 week the ground was workable. The next, the soil locked solid rivers froze mid-current and the wind cut through wool like it wasn't there. Men who had crossed continents with confidence suddenly realized they were one bad decision away from losing everything. By the early 1800s, most frontier settlers believed they had winter figured out. Build a log cabin, chink the gaps tight, stack firewood high, add a stone fireplace, and burn harder when it gets cold. That formula had been repeated thousands of times from Appalachia to the plains. It felt proven, familiar, safe. But in mountain country, that confidence often failed. Cabins that looked solid on paper bled heat through every log seam. Fireplaces pulled warm air straight up the chimney. Wind pressure forced cold air inside faster than fires could replace it. Families slept in shifts, feeding flames every hour, measuring survival by how fast the woodpile disappeared. And still, interiors barely reached livable temperatures. This is the context that matters. Not clever engineering, not innovation for innovation's sake, but desperation, fatigue, the quiet realization that what everyone knew might not be enough. Frontier winters didn't reward tradition, they rewarded physics. Some men responded by cutting more wood, others by building thicker walls. A few tried bigger fireplaces, but one man looked at the land itself and saw something different. He didn't ask how to fight the cold harder. He asked how to stop fighting it at all. That question would change how one family lived through a winter that broke stronger men. And it would expose a flaw in frontier thinking that had gone unquestioned for generations. The mistake wasn't lack of effort. It was building against the earth instead of with it. Frontier cabins looked strong, but strength was not the same as warmth. The classic log cabin was designed for speed, not efficiency. Logs were easy to source, easy to stack, and easy to repair. On the moving frontier, that mattered more than comfort. A man could raise walls in weeks, not months. In mild climates, that was enough. In mountain winter, it was a liability. The core problem was heat loss. Logs are dense, but they are not good insulators. Every log joint leaked air. Chinking cracked as wood dried and shifted. Wind pressure pushed cold air straight through walls while pulling warm air out through the chimney. The harder you burned, the faster heat escaped. Fireplaces made things worse. Most frontier cabins used open hearths. These pulled massive amounts of indoor air up the flue. For every cubic foot of smoke leaving cold air was sucked in through cracks to replace it. The fire warmed whoever sat close, but the room as a whole stayed cold. Cabin builders compensated the only way they knew how: more firewood. That meant cutting trees in dangerous conditions, hauling heavy loads through snow, and feeding fires around the clock. Men slept in short shifts, women woke to frozen wash basins. Children wore coats indoors. When the fire died, even briefly, temperatures dropped fast. The earth outside those cabins stayed relatively stable. Below the frost line, soil held steady warmth all winter, but cabins ignored that entirely. They sat exposed, surrounded by cold air on all sides, fighting physics instead of using it. Frontier builders were skilled. They were not foolish, but their knowledge came from tradition, not measurement. They trusted what had worked before, even when the environment had changed. Mountain winter didn't care about tradition. It punished surface-level solutions and rewarded designs that respected thermal reality. The earth already held heat. The mistake was pretending it didn't exist. Someone willing to break from cabin logic could stop losing heat before ever lighting a fire. While most settlers measured progress in stacked logs, one man measured it in depth. He didn't raise walls, he lowered the ground. To his neighbors, this looked like madness. Digging into a hillside meant weeks of labor before there was even a roof. No visible structure, no sense of security, just a dark opening in the earth and a growing pile of clay and stone. But this man wasn't guessing. He was remembering. He had grown up hearing stories of homes that didn't fight winter but ignored it. Homes carved into slopes. Homes that stayed calm when the wind screamed and the snow buried everything above. His knowledge didn't come from American frontier manuals. It came from older places, harsher places, where winter had shaped survival long before axes reached these mountains. Instead of choosing a flat site, he selected a south-facing hillside, not for views but for physics. Southern exposure captured low winter sun. The slope blocked prevailing winds. The earth itself would shield 3 sides of the structure. He dug deep enough to pass the frost line. That mattered more than square footage. Below that depth, soil temperature stayed stable year-round. It didn't care how cold the air became. The entrance wasn't flush with the outside. It stepped inward. Cold air would settle there instead of flooding the living space. Inside the ceiling stayed low. Warm air wouldn't be wasted. There was no large fireplace, no roaring flame, just a small controlled fire source designed to raise temperature slightly, not fight the cold from zero. Neighbors laughed because it didn't look like a home. It looked unfinished, temporary, vulnerable. But winter doesn't judge appearances, it tests systems. And this system was built around one principal frontier builders had overlooked. The ground was already warmer than the air. Frontier builders treated the earth like a threat. They worried about dampness, rot, collapse, and sickness. They believed fresh air meant exposure and that safety came from lifting a home above the ground, not sinking into it. These fears weren't irrational. Poorly built pits did fail. Bad drainage ruined supplies, weak roofs collapsed. So the lesson passed down was simple: stay out of the dirt. But that lesson was incomplete. The earth is not cold by default. Cold comes from moving air. Wind strips heat fast. Still air does not. Below the surface, air doesn't move. Temperature stabilizes. That difference is everything. At just a few feet down, daily temperature swings disappear. Go deeper, and even seasonal extremes fade. The soil becomes a thermal buffer. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it just as slowly. That's not theory. It's measurable reality. Frontier cabins sat fully exposed. Wind hit all 4 walls. Snow piled against doors and seams. Every storm worked against them. An earth-sheltered structure avoided most of that by design. 3 sides didn't face the weather at all. The key was drainage and structure, not avoidance. Clay-packed walls resisted airflow. Stone at the entrance blocked moisture. A slight slope carried water away. A roof supported by earth load distributed pressure evenly instead of concentrating it on beams. This wasn't about hiding underground. It was about borrowing the Earth's stability. The biggest mistake frontier culture made was assuming nature had to be conquered. In reality, the smartest survival systems cooperate. They redirect forces instead of opposing them. The ground doesn't steal heat. Moving air does. Wet materials don't rot if they can dry. Darkness doesn't kill. Cold exposure does. Once those distinctions were understood, the hillside stopped looking dangerous. It started looking like insulation. And when winter arrived in full force, the earth didn't panic. It did what it always does. It stayed steady. You don't need equations to understand why this worked. You need comparison. Air changes temperature fast. Earth does not. That single difference explains almost everything. A log cabin is surrounded by air. When outside air drops to 20-degree maximums, every wall is pressed by that cold. Heat inside escapes quickly because the temperature difference is extreme. The colder it gets, the harder the fire must work just to keep up. Earth behaves differently. Soil is heavy, dense, slow to change. At depth, it stays close to its average yearly temperature. in much of the northern Rockies that sits around the low 50s Fahrenheit. That means something critical. An earth-sheltered home doesn't start at 20 degrees, it starts at about 50 degrees. The fire inside isn't fighting winter, it's adjusting comfort. Raising a space from 50 to 65 degrees takes far less energy than raising it from 20 to 65. That's not efficiency trickery, that's common sense. The surrounding soil acts like a battery. It absorbs excess heat from the fire and releases it slowly when the fire dies down. Temperature swings flatten out. Rooms stay steady instead of spiking and crashing. This also changes airflow. In a cabin, hot air rushes upward and out the chimney. Cold air rushes in to replace it. In an earth-sheltered space, airflow is slower and controlled. Heat stays where people live. Thermal mass also works silently. No moving parts, no labor, no fuel. It doesn't break, it doesn't forget. Frontier builders didn't lack intelligence. They lacked patience. Wood cabins rewarded speed. Earth rewarded planning. Once the system was finished, daily labor dropped. Fires stayed small. Sleep came easier. The house stopped demanding constant attention. That was the real advantage. Not warmth alone, but stability. And in a winter that punished exhaustion, stability meant survival. Cold like that doesn't announce itself gently. It arrives with silence. Snow stops squeaking. Breath turns sharp. Metal bites skin instantly. By nightfall, even experienced men stop guessing and start counting losses. When the temperature dropped past 30 degrees, every weakness showed. Doors warped. Chinking failed. Chimneys iced. Fires burned non-stop and still fell behind. Inside many cabins, the temperature hovered just above freezing unless you sat close enough to the hearth to feel your eyebrows singe. Sleep became a problem. Fires couldn't be left unattended. Someone always stayed awake. Children cried from the cold. Adults hid fear behind routine. This was the moment most frontier systems collapsed. But inside the hillside home, nothing dramatic happened. The outside air plunged. The wind howled. Snow drifted high enough to bury fence posts. Inside, the temperature barely moved. The walls stayed cool, not cold. The floor never froze. Breath didn't fog. The fire that night was small, deliberately small. Just enough to raise the interior a few degrees. When it died down, the room didn't drop. The surrounding earth released heat back into the space slowly and evenly. No one fed the fire every hour. No one slept in shifts. The family went to bed and stayed there. This is where the difference became undeniable. A log cabin lives minute to minute. Miss one fire feeding and you pay for it. An earth-sheltered home lives in hours and days. It forgives mistakes. The cold didn't test courage, it tested systems. And when that test came, one design kept working without effort while the others demanded everything their owners had. That night proved the idea wasn't clever, it was correct. The ground didn't care how cold the air became, and neither did the people living inside it. What shocked people wasn't just that the hillside home stayed warm. It was how normal life felt inside it. There was no huddling, no crowding around a fire, no coats worn indoors. The air felt dry enough to breathe comfortably. Tools didn't frost, water didn't freeze. Bread rose on a shelf without being shoved next to heat. Children moved freely instead of staying pinned near warmth. Nights passed without alarms to feed flames. Mornings didn't begin with panic over dying embers. The temperature stayed in a narrow band, warm enough to live, cool enough to sleep well. It didn't spike near the fire and freeze near the walls. The entire space felt even. That evenness mattered. In cabins, comfort was local. One chair was warm, 2 steps away was cold. Earth-sheltered rooms erased that contrast. Heat moved, slowly spreading instead of rushing upward and out. Ventilation was gentle. Fresh air entered low and exited high, driven by natural draft, not wind force. Moisture left before it could build up. Walls stayed dry to the touch. Fuel use told the rest of the story. While neighbors burned cord after cord of wood just to stay functional, this home consumed a fraction of that. Not because the fire burned hotter, but because it didn't have to work as hard. The real advantage wasn't savings, it was margin. If weather worsened, there was buffer. If someone fell sick, the system didn't collapse. If wood ran low, panic didn't follow. Frontier's survival depended on reducing pressure points. Firewood was a pressure point. Sleep was a pressure point. Fatigue killed more people than cold ever did. Inside the hillside, those pressures eased. Warmth wasn't fought for. It was maintained. That distinction turned survival into living and living into something sustainable through the worst weeks of winter. Firewood was the real currency of winter. Every cabin depended on it. Every day began and ended with it. Men planned their hours around cutting, hauling, splitting, and stacking. When storms hit, the work didn't stop. It just got harder and more dangerous. In a conventional cabin, fire never rested. Miss a feeding and the temperature dropped fast. Let the fire die overnight and the house became unlivable by morning. Exhaustion built quietly. People didn't freeze suddenly. They wore down. This was the hidden cost of frontier heating. Burning more wood wasn't just inefficient. It consumed time, strength, and attention. It forced people into rigid schedules. It turned winter into a constant emergency. The hillside home broke that pattern. Fire became supplemental instead of central. It wasn't the heart of survival. It was a fine adjustment. A small fire in the evening carried warmth through the night. If it burned low, the house didn't punish anyone for it. That reduced labor changed everything. Wood piles lasted longer. Cutting could wait for safer days. Injuries dropped. Sleep improved. People woke rested instead of depleted. The math was simple. A cabin fighting 30 air had to replace heat constantly. The hillside home only had to maintain a small difference above the Earth's natural temperature. Less difference meant less loss. Less loss meant less work. This also reduced risk. Cabin fires were common. Chimneys cracked. Sparks escaped. A fire gone wrong in January meant death before help could arrive. Smaller fires meant smaller dangers. Frontier life was never easy, but systems that demanded constant attention drained people until mistakes became inevitable. The hillside design didn't make winter gentle, it made it manageable, and that was often the difference between making it through February or not. Frontier communities rarely changed their minds quickly. Experience was hard-earned, and pride was part of survival. Admitting a mistake meant admitting risk. Most settlers preferred familiar hardship to unfamiliar solutions, but extreme cold has a way of stripping excuses. As weeks passed and the hillside home continued to function, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Smoke rose constantly from cabin chimneys. Wood piles shrank fast. Faces looked tired. Meanwhile, one household moved through winter without urgency. People noticed. At first, visits were framed as concern. Then curiosity replaced pity. Men stood inside the earth-sheltered space longer than necessary, quietly observing. They touched walls, watched the fire, counted steps to the door. The conversations changed tone. Questions replaced warnings. How deep was the dig? How thick were the walls? Where did moisture go? How was air moving? No speeches were made, no victory claimed. The evidence spoke without help. One by one, respected builders stopped dismissing the design. They didn't suddenly abandon cabins, but the certainty cracked. A few admitted what mattered most: the system worked. Frontier knowledge was practical, not ideological. When something clearly improved, survival resistance weakened. The real shift wasn't imitation yet. It was humility. Acknowledging that tradition had limits took more courage than building another cabin. It meant recognizing that the land demanded adaptation, not repetition. By late winter, plans were being sketched quietly. Not public declarations, just notes, variations, partial earth sheltering, bermed walls, recessed entries. The hillside home didn't replace cabins overnight, but it broke the illusion that there was only one way to survive winter. And once that illusion cracked, new thinking had room to grow. What many settlers didn't realize was that this idea was not new. It only felt new to them. Earth-sheltered living had kept people alive in cold regions long before anyone cut logs on this continent. In places where winter punished mistakes for centuries, builders learned not to expose themselves unless they had no choice. In northern Europe, homes were dug into hillsides and capped with sod. In Arctic regions, earth and snow became insulation, not enemies. Across Asia, entire communities lived in cave dwellings carved into Loess cliffs, maintaining stable temperatures year-round with minimal fuel. Indigenous peoples across North America built semi-subterranean homes for the same reason. The ground was reliable when weather was not. The frontier mistake wasn't ignorance, it was assumption. Settlers brought building habits from milder regions and applied them everywhere, believing adaptation meant working harder, not thinking differently. The log cabin became a symbol of independence, so its flaws were ignored. Earth-sheltered structures lacked romance. You couldn't admire them from a distance. They didn't rise above the land. They blended into it. But survival doesn't reward symbolism. The hillside home worked because it followed principles refined across generations. Stable temperatures, reduced exposure, controlled airflow, and thermal mass. None of this required advanced tools. It required respect for what the environment already offered. Once settlers recognized that this was ancient knowledge, not a reckless experiment, resistance softened. Pride gave way to practicality. The realization was simple but uncomfortable. Americans hadn't invented winter survival. They were still learning it. And the land itself was the teacher. What mattered wasn't where the idea came from, but whether it kept people alive. On the frontier, usefulness outranked tradition every time. This wasn't innovation. It was memory returning at the moment it was needed most. Frontier history remembers what looks impressive. Tall cabins, big fires, hard labor made visible. What it forgets are the systems that worked quietly in the background. Earth-sheltered homes didn't announce themselves. They left no towering ruins. When abandoned, they blended back into the land and disappeared. That made them easy to forget. As railroads pushed west and towns grew, fuel became cheaper. Sawmills spread. Coal replaced wood. Speed mattered more than efficiency. Builders stopped adapting to place and started repeating standard designs. What had once been survival knowledge became unnecessary until it wasn't. Another force worked against this knowledge: pride. American frontier culture valued self-reliance, but often confused it with self-invention. Ideas brought from elsewhere were treated as inferior, especially if they didn't match familiar forms. Earth sheltering felt backward because it didn't resemble progress. It also required patience. Digging takes time. Planning takes thought. Cabins rewarded urgency. Earth rewarded restraint. As winters became less deadly thanks to supply chains and industry, restraint lost its appeal. So the knowledge faded, not because it failed, but because conditions temporarily made it optional. The danger in that is obvious in hindsight. When systems become fragile again, when fuel is scarce, supply lines break, or weather turns extreme, forgotten knowledge suddenly matters. The land hasn't changed. The physics hasn't changed. Only attention has. Earth-sheltered design wasn't lost because it was wrong. It was lost because people stopped needing to remember, until winters reminded them. History doesn't erase effective solutions. Comfort does. The lesson of the hillside home was never just about warmth. It was about mindset. Frontier survival rewarded people who listened more than they insisted. The land gave clear signals: wind direction, soil, temperature, snow behavior. but only to those willing to observe instead of dominate. Those who tried to overpower nature paid for it in exhaustion. Those who worked with it conserved strength. The mistake many settlers made was believing toughness alone would carry them through winter. Chop harder, burn more, endure longer. But endurance has limits. Physics does not. The hillside home succeeded because it reduced struggle. It accepted that cold air was an enemy, but Earth was not. It recognized that fighting temperature extremes head-on was inefficient while buffering against them was sustainable. That same principle applies beyond buildings. The frontier taught that systems matter more than effort, that good design saves lives quietly, that humility is not weakness, it's adaptation. The man who dug into the hillside wasn't avoiding hardship. He was choosing where to spend his energy. Modern language calls this passive design. The frontier called it common sense, learned the hard way. When fuel was limited, the smartest move was to need less of it. When labor was costly, the smartest structure was one that worked while you slept. When mistakes were deadly, forgiveness mattered more than strength. That winter proved something permanent. Survival is not about how much pain you can tolerate. It's about how little you need to suffer. The earth remembers what works, it always has. And when conditions turn harsh again, as they inevitably do, the old answers wait patiently beneath our feet, not buried, just ignored.